Thanks to the Aspen Global Change Institute for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about tropical forests. And I want to present whether tropical forests will slow or accelerate the rate of climate change going forward. So I want to start with this graph, which kind of keeps me up at night. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going forward through time to the present day. And that's from ice cores where when the ice is formed, tiny bubbles of air are captured in the ice, and then we can drill ice cores, take them out, and analyze that carbon dioxide in the layers of ice and reconstruct the history of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. For the last 60 years or so, we've had direct measurements. And what we can see from this, that somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans emerged, and we've been through glacial and interglacial cycles. And now we've pushed the amount of carbon dioxide outside of that envelope of all that we've experienced as humans. And this is what we're going to do this century. We may get hold of the climate change problem and drive emissions right down and stabilize carbon dioxide concentrations very low, or we may see them go way up towards 1,000 parts per million. And the reasons for that, these projections going forward into the future, are how much fossil fuel emissions there are, how many emissions from land use change, from essentially converting high carbon landscapes into low carbon landscapes, typically forest to agricultural lands, and the response of the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere, the land surface, ecosystems, to all this additional CO2 in the atmosphere and the additional warming, the other impacts of climate change. So what role do tropical forests play now and going into the future? So I now want to zoom into the last decade. And this is the global carbon cycle, but not presented as a cycle, but with the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as the centerpiece, because that's what drives the increases in temperatures and the other impacts of climate change. That's what we need to control. So we can see on the left-hand side of this diagram, we have fossil fuel combustion, and a petagram is 1 billion tons of carbon. So we have 9.4 billion tons of carbon going into the atmosphere from fossil fuel use. And then from land use change, another 1.6 billion tons. But not all of that carbon stays in the atmosphere and contributes to warming. Only around 45% of it is staying there. Around 23%, 2.5 billion tons each and every year of the last decade is going into the oceans. And the residual, what's left, is going somewhere into the terrestrial biosphere, somewhere into the land surface, around 31%. And the role of tropical forests is threefold and very important in the global carbon cycle. So firstly, on the land use change side, we see this roughly 1.5 billion tons of carbon going into the atmosphere. And it's actually from two opposing fluxes. So there's a much larger flux. These figures are really debated. There's a much larger flux from deforestation that's partially offset by regrowing vegetation and forest restoration, again, much of it in the tropics. So if we want to get carbon emissions down and get that increase in carbon dioxide down towards zero to control climate change, then lowering the deforestation rate and increasing the restoration rate can drive that net land use change term down to zero and perhaps negative. Now, I'm not going to talk about those two big areas of tropical forests, forest restoration and deforestation. What I want to talk about in this next 25 minutes or so is this residual flux to the land surface. And what is the role of the fairly intact forest that remains intact? How much carbon is that removing from the atmosphere and providing as a service to humanity in slowing the rate of climate change down, and what might happen in the future, and could it act in the opposite direction? The tropical forests, which I've spent a lot of time in over the last couple of decades, cover less than 10% of Earth's land surface, are incredibly important for biodiversity. More than half the world's species are in these forests. And they store almost half of the biomass carbon that's in living organisms. So they play an outsized role. And just to highlight where they are, so the Amazon Basin, Congo Basin, and forests across West Africa, and then through the islands of Southeast Asia. And why these forests play an outsized role in the global carbon cycle is because 50% of the dry weight of a tree is carbon. And this is a tree on the walk into one of my sets of monitoring plots in the Jar Biosphere Reserve in Southeast Cameroon. And you can see at the very bottom of that picture, I'm there for scale, standing on the path with one of my colleagues. So you have these enormous trees, and hundreds of them per hectare. So if there's very small changes driven by global environmental changes, such as more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or higher temperatures, and it's affecting all of these tropical forests, then even very, very small changes can have a big impact globally. And these small shifts maybe are often much too small for satellites to monitor, so we have to measure individual trees if we want to get at these subtle effects. So I've spent time directly measuring the carbon pools of these tropical forests. So the idea is that we try and find areas that are not directly impacted by humans. So this can isolate the natural effects that are not driven by logging or fires or other direct impacts. And we take usually a patch of forest, 1 hectare, 100 meters by 100 meters, and measure every single tree above 10 centimeters diameter and measure the heights. And then we can then use those to calculate the amount of carbon that is stored on the land. And one of the difficult jobs in these forests is identifying the species, and different species store different amounts of carbon. You can imagine a balsa wood tree at one end of the spectrum. A half-meter diameter balsa wood tree would hold a lot less carbon than a half-meter diameter mahogany tree of very dense wood. So we need to know the species, so we know the density of the wood, so we can calculate the carbon stocks and look at the changes in species over time as we remeasure these plots. To give you an idea about the species diversity, in some plots we can have 600 trees in a hectare, of which we have 300 different species. That's more species in 1 hectare of tropical rainforest than are the native species of all of Western Europe. So incredibly diverse and incredibly skilled to be able to identify these species in these remote forests. And if we want to monitor and assess the impacts at large scale, then we need lots of measurements. So I've tried to pull together with my colleague Oliver Phillips in South America and hundreds of other colleagues to pull together this long-term data where we have measured a forest at one point in time and then gone back and remeasured exactly the same trees with their individual tags So we can find the individual tree and measure it again, and then we can assess how the carbon stocks have changed over time. And we put them all into this single online data repository where people can manage their data, called forestplots.net. And we're now monitoring 2 million trees and over 5 million diameter measurements from 1,800 researchers across 53 countries. And what this allows us to do is to have a single chain of calculations right from the plot through to the quality control and then out through to estimate the carbon stocks. And it's a huge undertaking and critically involves local institutions and lots of researchers and local villages to get these standardized measurements. And so one of the real benefits of this work is we're working in all these cross-cultural teams of people working together to get this accurate, long-term, consistent data over time and in many different places. A real pleasure to work with all these different people. And what can we understand from this data? So in terms of South America, we've got two big gradients of soil fertility going from high soil fertility at the base of the Andes through to these really ancient soils in the Guiana Shield. And then from up in Colombia, ever wet conditions, some of the wettest rainforests in the world, through to the more marginal forests in southeast of the Amazon in Brazil. And we go and visit these places multiple times to then estimate the change in the carbon stocks of these Amazon forests. And when we pulled this together, here's a diagram where the green arrows show an increase in carbon storage in these forests. So on average, these forests are getting bigger and removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in tree trunks. And the red is where the biomass is decreasing and there's a release of carbon from the atmosphere. And across all these different plots over 25 years, the mean increase in these remote, intact, undisturbed rainforests was 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare per year. And that's around the mass of a small car being added to the wood of these forests in each hectare every year. So a really significant global carbon sink, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. These forests appear to be getting bigger and they're not in equilibrium with the environment. But this result was somewhat controversial at the time because we might expect that these forests that are not being directly impacted by humans are in equilibrium with their environment and shouldn't be growing bigger year on year on average. But if we think that more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is essentially fertilizing these forests and improving the conditions for the tree growth, then we might expect that these forests might be increasing in carbon storage over time. And what I did was think about, well, can we try and replicate this result, replicate these measurements somewhere else and see what result we get? So I spent a long time piecing together the data and visiting almost all of these sites to see in the second largest area of tropical forest, do we find a similar or a different result? And somewhat surprisingly, I think at the time, we found almost identical result. Most of these forest plots, most of the time, were increasing in carbon stocks of about the same magnitude, about a little more than 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare per year, suggesting that there's some global environmental change impacting these remote tropical forests. And in 2017, we pieced together enough data to try and say something about Southeast Asian forests and found the same level of impact and increase in carbon storage over time. So we compiled this data and with many colleagues to show that between 1990 and 2007, these purple colored bars showing the carbon sink, the carbon uptake in forest lands that remained forest. And we saw that about half of the global carbon sink was in forests in the tropics, and then around a quarter in the temperate zone, and then about a quarter in the boreal zone. And those gray bars are the deforestation, and the green bars are the uptake in recovering from past deforestation and degradation. So it appears that these tropical forests, the intact tropical forests, are providing a major break on the rate of climate change from in the 1990s and the early 2000s. But there were some worrying signs. And if we just recap, here's the world's largest area of tropical forest, the Amazon, and most forest plots are increasing most of the time. But in 2005, there was an unusual extreme drought. I was in the center of this picture where all those green arrows are in the center of the Amazon basin, and there was a huge drought that cut the electricity supplies to Manaus city of almost 2 million people, and severe local impacts of this drought. But it did give us the opportunity to send field teams as fast as we could to capture the impact of that unusual drought. And we saw that most of those forest plots that were monitored over that 2005 drought period declined in biomass, giving a committed emissions once that dead wood has respired and the carbon has been released to the atmosphere of almost 1 billion tons of carbon. So to contrast that with around 10 billion tons of carbon going into the atmosphere from fossil fuel use and land use change. So a significant impact of this drought. And this was a drought associated with Atlantic sea surface temperatures, which is the kind of drought we were starting to expect given the impacts of climate change. And here it did appeared. And then really concerningly, there was another strong drought in 2010, and there's been another one in 2015-16 associated with the El Nino. So there's a question about what the impact of this is on the forest carbon sink, and could these changes start to tip these intact forests from a carbon sink, slowing the rate of climate change down, to accelerating it. So we tried to answer that question in a recent paper from last year in Nature. And what we saw from the Amazon is that when we pieced together the data, we saw a decline in the carbon sink since the early 1990s. Now, what this graph shows is for 321 locations across the Amazon, where we have these measurements over time showing the change in the carbon sink. The black line is the average of all of the plots monitored in that year, or in that fraction of 1 year, in that month of a year. And the gray line is the uncertainty around that central estimate. And you can see in 2005, we get that dip in the carbon sink from the impact of the drought. And we can also see it in 2010, 2011, we get that dip from the drought. But it appears that the forest is not quite recovering to its same level of a carbon sink after the drought. So question is this happening elsewhere, or is this a regional Amazon phenomenon? Is this something to be really worried about, or may these forests recover their previous sink capacity and other forests are doing okay as well? So Africa is always lagging behind in terms of investment in science, but over the last decade, they've managed to piece together and work with partners and scientists and collaborators and institutions across the region to build up a similar kind of sample size as we have in the Amazon. And surprisingly, when we plot exactly the same analysis chain, and Africa is now in blue, and the solid line is the mean of all the plots that were monitored at that time. And we see that it's been fairly stable since we had a reasonable number of plots monitored in the 90s. So Earth's two largest tropical forests appear to have diverged in their carbon sink capacity, which presents us with a kind of conundrum about why that's the case. But on a bit of a deeper inspection, there's obviously some forest plots that we have get monitored and then some drop out of the sample as they stop being monitored. So there's not a consistent 244 plots monitored across the whole of the 30-year period. And if we look at those plots that have had the greatest number of remeasurements, really intensively monitored plots from the last 15 years of the last century and the first 15 years of this century, then we do start to see this similar kind of saturation that we saw in the Amazon, nowhere near as strong and nowhere near as dramatic and later than we see in the Amazon. But there is a hint that it's beginning in Africa. So we have some evidence from the two largest areas of tropical forest that there's a declining per unit area tropical forest sink capacity. And we know from deforestation statistics that the amount of intact forest has been shrinking year on year. So if we scale up our estimates from our plots to the whole continent, tropical forests in Africa and South America, and we add on the much more sparse information for the much smaller area that we have in Southeast Asia for a pan-tropical estimate, we can see that in the 1990s, these forests were removing about 1.3 billion tons of carbon each year from the atmosphere and slowing down the rate of climate change. But by the 2010s, this is only 0.7%. So we lost getting on for half of the total sink capacity. So that's a really kind of surprising and worrying conclusion from this forest plot data. And the question is what's really going on, and can we use that to start to make some tentative projections about the future? So we can use this plot data to look at the carbon gains, so all the increments from our tree growth, all the woody increments, and the increments from new trees that recruit into these intact forests. And we see, as we might expect, if there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, increasing photosynthesis and increasing forest growth, then both of these continents show an increase in growth over time. But it appears to be some level of saturation of that increase in the Amazon in the very recent past. And we can try and separate out the impacts. So we have a global increase in carbon dioxide. We also have a global increase in mean annual temperature. And then on the far right-hand side, the graph here is the maximum cumulative water deficit, which is just a way of saying drought. And some places are getting more droughted. So each of the dots in these graphs is a single long-term forest monitoring site. And the shading, the deeper the blue is, the longer, so more than 20 years of monitoring for the deepest blue. And blue is Africa and brown is the Amazon. So this plot data can show us for the first time that when we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we do see on average a greater carbon gains, suggesting the CO2 fertilization impact. We also see a strong negative impact of higher temperatures. So higher temperatures are expected to increase respiration costs and slow down growth, cut off photosynthesis in the warmest part of the day, and therefore slow growth. And that's what we see. Forest plots that have higher mean annual temperature have slower rates of carbon gains of growth. And similarly for more droughted plots show less growth. And what's happening in the Amazon is these combination of higher temperatures and more frequent droughts appear to be slowing down the rate of increase of growth in those plots. And the core reason for this is that in Africa, the forests are on average around 200 meters higher altitude than the bulk of the Amazon basin. So they're just that little bit cooler. So they're not seeing these very, very high temperatures that we see in the Amazon. And I think a more interesting and dramatic story is that explains the difference between the two continents is there's a big increase in carbon losses from tree mortality in the Amazon, but that is very muted, if there at all, in Africa. And this is what's driving the big difference between the two continents in terms of the carbon sink. And the reason is a little bit complex, but this is the carbon residence time. So when a molecule of carbon dioxide is fixed from photosynthesis, how long does it stay on average in the system, in the wood? And if we look at this carbon residence time, how dynamic these forests are, from the very slow dynamic forests that are where the carbon is staying for over 100 years to these very dynamic and fast turnover forests where it's only staying for around, say, 40 or 50 years. It's those fast dynamic forest plots that are showing the big increase in losses. And what we think is that they were the forests that increased in growth first, and then you're seeing that past growth release from the forest as increased mortality later on. And the difference between the Amazon and Africa is that on average, African forests have much longer carbon residence times. They have the same amount of forest growth, but their mortality is much lower, and therefore they're much higher biomass and are a sink for longer. So just going on to think about the future. So we used a statistical model to try and estimate what might happen into the future. So we have a model, statistical model with the change in carbon dioxide concentration, the change in mean annual temperature, and the change in drought, and any change in carbon residence time. And that's in the dark blue, and then the gray bands are the raw data. And then we project those forwards into the future to see what the sink might be like. So it's a spatial extrapolation method. And what it shows is that we see a modest decline going forward in the African forests if current trends continue in terms of temperature rises and CO2 increases. But in the Amazon, this decline in the sink continues very steadily to become a carbon source in the middle of the 2030s. Now, if the Amazon intact forest did become a carbon source into the 2020 in the 2030s, what that would mean is that the amount of tree mortality would be slightly exceeding the amount of tree growth, and on average we would be seeing the overall mass of the forest declining slightly and on average releasing carbon to the atmosphere. And what these extrapolations, statistical extrapolations, show is a saturation and a decline in the carbon sink decades ahead of even the most pessimistic climate change models. And I think, and we've got a new paper coming out in a couple of months, that this all hinges on this question of the carbon residence time and getting the mortality right in these models going forward. And the models are what we really need going forward, rather than these spatial extrapolations, to get the mechanistic understanding right and to get these projections going forward into the future. So to wrap it up and go back to the beginning of the talk, if we go back to this schematic of the global carbon cycle with the amount of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the center, but for the 1990s, then the residual carbon sink was around 2.6 billion tons. So the same fraction, almost a third of the carbon going into the atmosphere, was ending up somewhere on the land surface. And intact tropical forests were taking up, according to these ground observations, about 1.3 billion tons of carbon, about 50% of the terrestrial carbon sink. So a really significant fraction. But if we then look forward to the most recent decade, the residual carbon sink has kept pace with the increase in fossil fuel emissions. So it's now risen to 3.4 billion tons of carbon each year removed from the atmosphere and going somewhere on the land surface. But our intact tropical forests, because there are less of them and the sink strength is less, particularly in the Amazon, are only taking up about 20% of that 3.4 billion tons of carbon, rather than the 50% just 20 years before. And what's surprising, I think, about these results is just how fast the carbon cycle is changing. So some take-home messages from this work. So it's important to remember, while we're talking about a saturation and then a future decline in the sink, tropical forests is still globally important carbon sink, providing a really important service to humanity by removing about 2.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere each year and storing it in the massive intact tropical forests. But as a percentage of global emissions, it was about 17% in the 1990s, but it's dropped to just 6% now. And this sink, as saturated, is beginning to decline. And it does appear to be the beginning of one of these carbon cycle feedbacks earlier than we thought. But it also highlights because the land sink overall globally has kept up with the increase in emissions, then the extratropical sink must have been more than proportionately increasing. So really monitoring this sink, not just in the tropics, but outside the tropics, is incredibly important going forward. And then my last slide, to be much more positive about the future of tropical forests, I think there's three things to consider, which is, they need protection with local people at the heart of the decision making, and protecting them was also about minimizing greenhouse gas emissions to stabilize the climate, to reduce the climate impacts on these forests. And they need to stay connected, because species are going to move and are moving as the climate is moving. So forests need connections both north and south, and from low to high altitude areas, so species can move as the climate changes to minimize biodiversity losses. And then finally, there's bringing back forests through forest restoration, which I think is going to become much more important going forward into the future. So I'd just like to say thanks to all my many collaborators and students and postdocs over the years who helped me piece together this story, and thanks to everyone for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions.